is the season of poll promises and giveaways from both parties or all parties. And we have with us the most appropriate guest who can tell us what kind of schemes actually work for the poor and what kind of schemes work for the politicians. We have with us Professor Abhijit Banerjee, who is by far the best expert, best researcher, and best professor of poor economics. That is incidentally the name of his book as well. Professor Banerjee, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, well, first up, there are, like I was saying, it's the season of poll promises, and I will try and run past you each of the promises that are going to be made or that is in the buzz. The first of them is a package for farmers. What do you think is the best way to help farmers? There are three kinds of, programs being spoken about. One, of course, is a loan waiver. The other one is a universal basic income or a basic income. And a third one is some kind of price support. Your idea of what works?
So I think that just going in the reverse order, I think what we've done with the price support is we've kind of gone the opposite direction. I think in the sense that we've banned exports. We have imported when we had large surpluses. So we've moved the terms of trade against agriculture quite kind of with a clear and I think rather committed hand. So I think that if you look at what happened to the farmers, if we just let world market prices be the prices that rule, they would have not, the distress wouldn't have been there, or most of it wouldn't have been there. I think so. I do feel, given that we have some obligation to do something about them. And the question is a bit, what's the fairest thing to do? The problem, so I think the advantage of loan waivers is that we know how to do it. At some level, they're straightforward to implement. The disadvantage is also more or less the same thing, which is we know how to do it because we know who the people with loans are. Yes. They're not, and they're not necessarily the poorest. They're not necessarily the most honest. There might be people who are, strategic about these things. So we are in a sense compensating people for actions that could have been taken strategically. It creates a set of issues which are not desirable. Oh, now, yes. Given that, I wouldn't say that it's even given that, it may well be that at this point they really need relief, and this was done because there was no choice. This is the only mechanism. We can talk about universal basic income, which I have in other public fora at least generally supported, but I do think that there is a real issue there of how much can we afford if it's universal. And I think the government's other initiative was trying to deal with that. That was the Fasal Bima Yojana. Yes. So one thing the government could have done instead of any of these is just implemented that better. That was very badly implemented. It hasn't really reached people. And part of the reason was that it was designed in a way that was completely ham-handed, and that particular opportunity was lost. So another thing the government could have done, aside from these three options, is to just implement that better, to make sure that people get stable prices and they don't get punished in droughts. And that already would have solved a fair amount of that problem. As I think if we didn't create the price distortions we've been creating, that would have helped. So I don't think these are the only options.
All right. Maybe a better version of the Fasal Bima Yojana is also in the works, we understand, as a package. But before that, wear your economist hat and explain to us the macro problems that this will create. Whether it is a universal income or loan waivers, both create macro problems. So let me first start with the fiscal deficit. Will not that be counterproductive if we were to overspend? And, inflation or higher interest rates would kill what we get by way of income.
I think that's right. I think that if you think about what we can afford, I think the only way to really pay for a pay for something like a universal basic income would be right now to start thinking of what schemes to cut. I mean, in the medium run, I think we are undertaxed. We really, despite whatever the financial sector will tell you, we have year after year, we have kind of let the slab drift up so that we've never really had more than 2.5% of the population in the tax net. And then there is all kinds of other, people don't pay the taxes, etc. But I think we have done very little on sort of generating a good, effective, progressive, direct taxation. We're sort of now saying GST will solve our problems. GST is an extremely regressive tax. It has no progressivity whatsoever.
We've tried by making it 5 and 12 and 18.
But it's still difficult to do, because if you either you give up lots of revenue, or you basically collect it from everybody, and we're not doing very much of anything else. We're moving towards one slab, and I think that's probably a good idea, but then we haven't really put any effort into creating, the usual mechanism for expanding the tax base is by keeping the bottom slab fixed, and as the people get richer, they pay more taxes. That's what happened in China. China was below us. They had 1.5% of GDP in direct taxes, and now they have 8 or something. And if we went up to 8, we would have money to pay for lots of things. So I do think that the first order, we shouldn't miss that big picture story, which is that we need more taxes.
Okay. Well, that point is taken, and I guess even in GST, as people declare indirect taxes, the hope is that you will get their direct tax, their income as well, and income tax may go up. That is the hope. That is the hope.
Right.
Okay, let's come to the programs itself. The other program that is being talked about is a basic income of maybe 2,000 to 2,500 per BPL family below the poverty line. That is somewhat identifiable because now there are Jan Dhan accounts. Is that the way to go at all?
Well, I think the question is, how do we, the disadvantage of that is, A, the BPL, the identifiability of who's BPL is extremely porous. I mean, we were talking yesterday about a government scheme in a state which has one of the reputation for being one of the best in the state, a government scheme for pensions, and they were saying that about of the bottom 20%, about a third of those get it. Okay. So once you get into targeting, you absolutely get into this issue of, how do I discover who's BPL? Well, there are all kinds of mechanisms, but those are very porous mechanisms with lots of claims and counterclaims going on. And the result is that especially the most vulnerable parts of society tend to be squeezed out of that process. They don't have loud voices. They're not very good at making political claims, and so they don't get anything. So I do think that once you
those
get
who need it most may not get it at all.
Yeah, once we get into BPL, then we really get into this issue of, is this really about the people who are close to the poverty line and who are therefore and are politically active, or are these really about the poorest? And that's the reason why I hesitate to go down that route. The universal part of universal basic income was exactly to avoid that problem, which is, let's not target, because targeting is so fraught a process and has failed in so many places in so many ways.
Okay. Oh, well, in that case, let me discuss the other issues. Since you spoke about poor and vulnerable, your thoughts on the recently passed amendment. Of course, it's not fully passed. It's only passed by the Lok Sabha, that 10% of government jobs and educational institutions be reserved for the economically weak in the socially higher categories. Is this a recipe for more problems, or is it in some way equitable?
It may some way be equitable. The real problem is not equity here. The equity case you could make in many different directions. I don't particularly, you could talk about historical discrimination or not. I do feel that that's a multidimensional issue. Yes. Where I really think this is a disaster is it keeps the problem focused on reallocating quotas. And this is the battle we've been fighting essentially. Rajasthan, for example, the Minas and the Gujars are fighting. In Gujarat, the Patels are fighting. You have
Maharashtra, the Marathas want to get in.
Will get it or not, depending on the Supreme Court, and this is whether the Constitution can be amended. There's a whole bunch of issues here, which basically mean at the margin there's always a group. The group is always unhappy, and in the macro picture, it's only bad news there, in the sense that the fraction of jobs that count for these as a fraction of the labor force is falling, has been falling for years and years and years. So there is less jobs, and it becomes more and more acute fight on who can
for less and less.
For less and less. That to me is like, first order challenge for the political system is to move the conversation away from quotas. That quotas are not going to save anybody. Just there are not enough jobs. Government is shrinking as a fraction of the GDP. So there's just no, not as GDP, as a labor force. So you can't possibly hope to really deliver that to everyone.
Yes, some politician has to call the bluff. Some leader has to call the bluff. But you've called another bluff, and no one has paid attention to that people are hankering after government jobs because it is too highly paid. Is that something that needs to be brought into political discourse?
Absolutely. Nobody wants, that's a hot potato nobody wants to touch. But I think the honest truth is, if you look at comparable level GDP, which countries pay their teachers anything like us? There aren't any. We are very generous to our
best paid teachers.
Best paid teachers. We're really and in fact, relative to GDP, we pay our teachers much more than the US. Much more. So we're really very, very generous to our government employees. They get benefits, and I don't grudge them that. I think but it creates this problem that's people's idea of what a good job is. And as a result, they don't really want any other job. And you can see that when you look at the statistics, what's in the National Sample Survey, what's striking is that if you take the people who have 10 years or more of education, at age 26, 20% or more of them are not working. Now, you would say that where will the jobs be? Look at the people who are below class 10 education. They're all working. All the males are working. And at age 32, all males are working, whether or not you have 10 years of education. So there has to be jobs for somewhere. They're not taking the jobs because they don't like those jobs. And why don't they like the jobs? They're jobs in retail, they're in hospitals, and places like that.
Pizza delivery.
They don't like those jobs. They want government jobs.
Yes.
And so they'd rather wait it out, take tests, and not take those jobs.
Okay, on that note, we have to take a break, but we are coming back with lots more questions to Professor Abhijit Banerjee. Don't go anywhere.